Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus went out beside the sea, and the whole crowd gathered round him, so he taught them. Later, as he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And Levi got up and followed him. And as Jesus sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes and the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick do. I have come to call not the self-righteous, but the sinners." The Gospel inspired by God. For about the first 6 or 7 months of a newborn's life, he lives in what's described in psychology as a kind of an oceanic bliss. The child can't really differentiate between self and other, so as in the child's world there's just the me and the now, and I totally control my environment. Somewhere around the age of about 8 months, the horrible realization begins to dawn upon the child that he does not control the environment. In fact, that he's in some senses a victim of the environment, that other people call the shots. And so at this stage, the ego begins to constellate for the child. And the child realizes that in some senses, the environment is very, very hostile, that the child in some senses is powerless to control the environment. And so that's when the child begins to develop what psychology will then call defense mechanisms, ways of kind of dealing with this horrible realization that the environment is in charge, I am not in charge of the environment. So it develops a whole bunch of strategies to try to psychologically survive the kind of the hostility of the environment. The awful realization that mother doesn't love me, she abandons me, she goes off for hours at a time, I have no idea where she is, and I'm screaming my head off in a dirty diaper, hungry or cold or whatever, and there's nobody there to pick me up and cuddle me. And so the child develops all these strategies to try to contend with that. And over the next 9 or 10 years, more of these defense mechanisms will come in place, up into our teenage years. And so you get teenagers beginning to act out in order to kind of respond to the environment. So sometimes they'll try to be the good boy, hopefully that mommy and daddy will love me and I'll be okay. Sometimes the kid will act out, get into all kinds of mischief in school or wherever, or be the class clown. So we got a whole bunch of ways of trying to deal with this horrible realization. Now, the defense mechanisms in some senses are necessary to protect the child against the extraordinary fear engendered by its vulnerability. But sometimes the defense mechanisms themselves cause greater problems than the environment against which they were trying to protect the child. And I've sometimes used a kind of a graphic image from my own childhood in Ireland. I grew up in Ireland at a time when Ireland was very poor, and we were a very, very poor family. But the good thing was that mothers didn't go to the shops to buy bread. They would bake bread. 2 or 3 times a week they'd bake bread. So there was always lots of fresh dough in the house. And so if a child swallowed a foreign object, like a child is playing with a marble or a pebble or a piece of a pencil and swallows it, the mothers would immediately force feed the child lots of fresh dough. And the theory was that the dough would insulate the foreign object in the gastrointestinal tract. And then for the next 3 or 4 days, the child couldn't use the bathroom such as there was. There were outdoor latrines anyway. You'd have to poop in the yard. And mother would go through with a stick to make sure that you'd actually gotten rid of the foreign object. Now occasionally, they'd overdo it and they'd give you so much fresh dough that you'd be bound up for a week, constipated for a week. And so sometimes the defense mechanism was worse than the foreign object. Now, that's the story of defense mechanisms. That very, very often the defense mechanisms we put in place as little children become a bigger problem than the environment against which we were trying to protect ourselves. And at some stage in our adult life, with some friend, trusted friend or some professional person, we have to try to examine, what are the defense mechanisms that are holding us back psychologically and spiritually, and have the courage to go out someplace and poop, and go through it with a stick and figure out, have I gotten rid of this? And try to erect different ways of interacting with the environment. Now this is true not just for individuals, it's also true for cultures. Cultures develop their own kind of set of defense mechanisms. And that's the whole origin of xenophobia and war and aggression. It's a culture trying to protect itself against either the real or the perceived threat of the global environment in which it finds itself. And this morning's story comes out of that kind of milieu. To understand this story, you have to understand that in the year 721 BC, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel are taken off into exile by the great Assyrian Empire. And they're never heard of again. They either got assimilated or they got destroyed. They're never heard of again. The last two tribes in the southern part of the country survived for another 130 years. And then in the year 587 BC, the Babylonian Empire, which had overthrown the Assyrian Empire in the meantime, came in and deported the last two tribes of Israel. And now they're wondering, are we going to go the same way that our brothers in the north have gone? How can we retain, our togetherness, our individuality? So they came up with the strategy. And the strategy was called holiness by separation. And they harken back to a great vision that the prophet Isaiah had way, way, way before them in the year 742 BC. He's sitting in the temple and he has this great vision of God's train filling the temple. And the angels around God singing in Hebrew, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. And they refer to this and they figured out that what makes God holy is his otherness, his total separation from everything else. And therefore, our holiness code, in order to survive, it has to be a holiness code based on separation from the environment in which we now find ourselves. So they created the great laws of separation, the great laws of Judaism, 5 of them mainly, 5 laws of separation. And the first one is, you separate yourself from the Gentiles by refusing to intermarry with them. The second one, you separate your menfolk from their menfolk by the sign of circumcision. That immediately delineates, Judean from a Gentile. The third one is that you separate the holy day of the week from the other profane days of the week. You create the Sabbath. This is when the Sabbath is created. The fourth one is that you create kosher and treif. You create the clean foods and the unclean foods, kosher and treif. And the fifth one is table fellowship. You refuse to sit down at table with sinners, however the sinners are seen. And this is the context out of which Jesus is talking today. So the thing is, it worked. It allows those two tribes to survive in exile. And for the next 500 years, they survive. But now they're back in the land of Israel, and the land of Israel has been conquered by the Romans about 70 BC. So at the time of Jesus, the Romans have been in there for almost 100 years. And Judaism is fragmenting under the pressure of this colonialism by the Romans. And there are several different responses. How are we going to deal with this situation? And the first response was the response of the leaders, the Sanhedrin and the high priest family. And that was collaboration with the Romans. So we collaborate them, maybe they won't destroy us entirely, and we get to be in our positions of power. So the aristocracy collaborated with the Roman occupation. That was one response to it. The Pharisee party believed that by, a fastidious adherence to the law, they could somehow persuade God to come in and set them free. That was their response, a fastidious, keeping to the law. The Essene party believed that the temple itself had gotten corrupted and the priesthood had gotten corrupted, so they withdrew into the desert and became monks. So that was their response. That is how they would somehow persuade God to come back and to save them. And then there was a fourth party called the Zealot party, and these were guerrilla fighters. And they figured out, we're going to kick the Romans out of it through blood and guts. So they're the 4 great responses to the situation of Judaism at the time of Jesus. But Jesus comes in with a totally different, a 5th response. And it's a totally different holiness code. It's holiness based not on separation, but on association. And so maybe the most important thing that Jesus did in his entire public ministry wasn't so much that he raised people from the dead, or that he cured lepers. It wasn't so much that he fed the 5,000 in the desert. It was that he threw banquets on a regular basis. He went all over the country throwing banquets to which everybody was invited. The Jew and the Gentile alike, the tax collector, the sinner, the Pharisee, like everybody was invited. And you can easily figure out the difference between an ordinary meal and a banquet in the Hebrew scriptures. When people were eating their ordinary meals, they ate standing up. When they were at a banquet, they ate reclining. They would recline on one elbow, typically the left elbow, and feed themselves from the table with the right hand. So when you ever find the phrase, they were reclining at table, you know that you're in the presence of a feast, not just an ordinary meal. And that's the phrase that you find again and again and again as Jesus is going around inviting people to these Eucharistic banquets to which everybody was invited. So in this particular case today, we find he's eating with a bunch of tax collectors and sinners. And the Pharisees are appalled that he's breaking this holiness code of table fellowship. And Christ makes this extraordinary response, I've come not to heal the well, but the people who are sick. Not to deal with the self-righteous, but the ones who realize that they're in trouble. And so his whole ministry was a ministry of overcoming a holiness code based on separation and instituting a holiness code based on association. And so it was really painful for me as a Catholic priest that the very symbol of inclusivity, the Eucharist itself, which was the symbol par excellence of Jesus saying there is nobody who is not invited to the banquet of God's largesse, and we use that as a way of differentiating between Catholics and non-Catholics. They can't communicate with us, they can't be in communion with us, they can't receive communion at Eucharists run by Catholics. We differentiated the sinners. Anybody in mortal sin couldn't come up and receive communion. Any divorced and remarried person couldn't come up and receive communion. Any person who was gay couldn't come up and receive communion. So we start immediately again creating all of these distinctions, saying who's in and who's out, using the very symbol that Christ had used to include everybody as the measure of how to exclude people. Karen.
So that was a really interesting explanation. So in some ways, Jesus must have been a threat to their even sense of survival.
Absolutely.
If he was willing to, to open those doors.
Exactly.
Whereas they might not have seen, for some reason, didn't see their sense of survival threatened by collaborating with the Romans. Yes. But they would see it the other way.
It's a great insight, great insight. So almost everything this man did was a source of dismay to the authorities. Secular and social and spiritual, everything he did. His entire theology, his lifestyle, his walking around the desert with groups of women, everything he did was contrary to the given conventional wisdom of the times. Yeah. It's very hard for us to appreciate at this distance just how controversial a character that he was, theologically, sociologically, psychologically. There's a reason that God, created, millions of different species of life on planet Earth even alone. Why didn't God just create fish, or just birds, or just mountains, or trees, or whatever? But there are like millions and millions and millions of species. So that God, part of the extraordinary teaching ability of nature for me is its ability to balance prodigality and parsimony. That nature always finds very elegant and simple solutions to problems. At the same time, it is totally prodigal in its use of colour. And if you look at the colours of birds or the colours of fishes or whatever, it just does it for the sheer heck of creating artwork. And so if nature itself and God creates this extraordinary plethora of possibilities, why would we want to confine, God's kingdom, to a stereotype of, in the Jewish world, the male, Jewish, healthy and wealthy. In the Catholic world, you got to be Catholic, in communion with Rome. If you're Muslim, you have to regard the Prophet Muhammad as the seal of the prophets. So we're all trying to confine God's, prodigality to a particular little niche. I mean, it's true that all of us have our edges, and sometimes it's more obvious than other times, but it's impossible to be confined to a human body and to grow up in any human any human family without taking aboard a whole bunch of prejudices, most of which we are totally unaware. Very, very often we're not even aware that our behavior is prejudicial until it's pointed out by some organization or some group whatsoever. I mean, I'm reading a book at the moment, fascinating book by a guy called Stephen Schwartz, called The 8 Laws of Spiritual Success. And he pointed out something that was amazing to me. I'd never realized it. If you look at all the great social movements of the last 200 or 300 years in this country, abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, animal rights, ecology, All of these were spearheaded by tiny groups of friends, Quakers. Quakers are only 87,000 members of our population at the moment is 319 million Americans. The Quaker population is 87,000. Throughout American history, it's been small little groups of Quakers who spearheaded all of these movements and continue to do it. Yeah, amazing, amazing. They actually got the Nobel Prize in 1947 for their work during World War II. There was a group in London called the Bomb Squad. They refused to take part in war, but they would go around in their trucks, groups of Quakers, and they would pick up unexploded bombs and take them to a safe place that they could be detonated, and often the bombs went off in their trucks. At the end of the war, in 1947, they were given the Nobel Prize, the group, the Nobel Peace Prize for their work. So this tiny little band of people, very unostentatiously, has been spearheading all of these movements, pointing out to us the prejudices that we didn't even realize we had. It's not even that we were aware of these prejudices and did it anyway. We didn't even realize they were prejudicial until little people like this begin to point it out and work for that. So let me come to the first one and then go on to the second one. The deal with the tax collectors at the time of Jesus was the following. When the Romans occupied a terrain, they collected taxes, very, very heavy taxes from the people. But they didn't send their soldiers around from door to door to collect it. They would ask for a volunteer in a village who would collect the taxes on behalf of the Romans. And so Bob would volunteer, I'll do it for Palo Alto. And I'd say, I'm the Roman governor, I'd say, Mr. Fisher, I want you to collect $5 million from Palo Alto. Now, you have to pay me $5 million. You can collect as much as you want. If you can manage to collect $10 million, go for it. But you need to pay me $5 million. So you pay me $5 million up front, and then you go and you start exacting taxes from the people, really bullying them. And everything you make over $5 million is your profit. And so they weren't just tax collectors in the ordinary sense. They were seen as collaborators with the Roman occupation, so they were hated for this very reason. Yeah. The second point you're making, Bob, about the very first reading is the story of the hunt for the first king of Israel. And the backstory to it is that after the Israelites had escaped from Egypt and spent 40 years wandering in the desert, they entered the promised land in the year 1210 BC. But it's occupied. There are very sophisticated tribes of people like the Phoenicians, the great, seafaring people that they call the Philistines. So they spent 200 years conquering the country. They didn't conquer Jerusalem until the year 1010 BC. Jerusalem was a pre-existing city that they conquered in 1010 BC. And during this period of time, for this 200 years of conquest, they didn't have any designated leaders. They operated what were called the judges. And the judges were ad hoc military leaders. So they were going to go to battle against a group. They would just elect somebody for the day, and he was in charge of the army for the day, And when the battle was over, he reverted to lay status. One of them was a woman called Deborah, a very famous warrior woman. And so, depending on when the battle was due, they would elect somebody to lead them into battle. So their leadership was totally on an ad hoc basis, as needed, and then they would revert to lay roles. I found the very same thing. The peoples I worked with in Kenya, the Kalenjin peoples, had no designated chiefs. So the British found it impossible to conquer the Kalenjin. With all the other tribes, they would either bribe the chief or threaten the chief, and then they had the whole tribe in their hand. The Kalenjin had no designated chiefs. Our priests, for a particular ceremony, somebody would be made priest for the day, or for a cattle raid, somebody would be made leader of the cattle raid for the day, and then revert to lay status. So it's very hard to administer or conquer a group that has no leadership. Very, very difficult. So this was the state of Israel for 200 years. And then at some stage, they began to look around them and see all of the other nations have kings. We want kings like everybody else. And the judge at the time was this guy Samuel. And Samuel said, no, God is your king. There's no, we want a king like everybody else. That's why all the other nations are prospering, and we're where we are. And Seán said, I'll tell you what will happen. If you have a king, he'll force your kids into servitude. He'll have bakers and, horse people and soldiers, and he'll exact taxes, and he'll take the best crops of your land. No, we want a king. He said, okay, you want a king? I'll give you a king. And today's the story of how the first king was found. Just a young boy who's out looking for his dad's lost donkeys. And Samuel sees him, and God says, that's the guy I want to appoint to a king. So that's kind of the backstory. And the psychological understanding, of course, of that, in some senses, all of us, are a child of God, to be anointed, You know, the word anointing is the word, actually, the Hebrew word Messiah. The Messiah literally means the one who was anointed. So anybody who's anointed is a Messiah. And the Greeks will translate the word Messiah into the word Christos. And so the word Christ just literally means the one who has been anointed. Every one of you has been anointed. At baptism, you're anointed with chrism. You know, at ordination, you get anointed with chrism again. And so everybody is anointed as a child of God. I believe that we're anointed. I said this a few weeks ago in the homily, that in the course of being born from your mother's womb, the vaginal juices are the chrism of ordination. And the waters of the amniotic fluids are the waters of baptism. You're baptized in your mother's womb, and you're anointed as a priest on the way out by the vaginal juices. The vaginal juices don't just confer, you know, immunity against allergens in the environment. They're your ordination right. And so the search for the King of Israel is one that every single one of us does. The King is within. The King is your soul. And so that is the King of Israel. That is the one who's going to lead you into the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of heaven, the soul within the self.
I have a question, which is, I'm impressed with the Quakers and what you've been talking about. So these issues of sort of equality and, you know, in so many ways, were clearly not within their community. So they must have been outward looking to the world to see where the problems were, because it would not have been a first-person experience, either the war or the, you know, the race issues or the women's issues or none of that.
I mean, even their own style.
And being so isolated, it's just really interesting to me because so much rises out of your rebellion against something it's been done, you feel like it's been done to you. And clearly that was not the case for them. They had some global responsibility or something that is unusual.
The more I learn of the Quakers, although, you know, attending meetings of the Quakers are real dull, boring efforts. There's no great liturgy, there's no colour, there are no designated leaders whatsoever. It's a real boring meeting to attend. But they're probably the most spiritual people I've ever come across who really, really walk the talk, you know, and identify what the issues are. And part of their shtick is you can't take credit, nor do you expect to be even acknowledged for the job you're doing. So there are no designated leaders who are going to go out, you know, follow me, I'm going to show you the way. None of that whatsoever. Everything is done, you know, this book that we've been using at COJ for the last few months to kind of organize our meetings, it's very, very, very much egalitarian. Everybody is a leader, you know, open to spirit. And so you're absolutely right. I don't know of any other group of people who've walked their talk, you know, as profoundly and for as much of human history since they've existed as this little group. A tiny little group, 87,000 people out of 319 million in this country.